Thank you. Hey, everybody. Let's get started. So I want to talk about reflexive content, use conditions, and modal normativism. And that's Amie Thomasson's approach to modality, effectively. It's a largely pragmatic approach, right? So what we're going to cover today, I had some intro slides. We're going to quickly just get into it because we've got a lot of stuff to cover. What we're basically going to talk about is the official truth-conditional content story famously leads to paradoxes, right? Lots of famous semantic paradoxes come from the assumption of direct reference and the official content story, right? Broader strains of truth-conditional content like reflexive content, reflexive referential theory, have been developed to address some of these issues, right? But they still leave like non-truth conditional aspects of conventional meaning unaccounted for, like expressives, right? And expressivity in general. If we consider reflexive content as a special flavor of use-conditional content, which I'll get into what that means in a little while, it opens the door to a more complete picture of full content, right? Accommodating non-truth conditional notions of content via Predelli's notion of bias, right? But then we can expand beyond that and make some connections to the use-conditional approach provides a new perspective on interesting work in functionally disparate notions of language, right? And by functionally disparate, I mean non-descriptive, right? So if you think of the truth-conditional approach as broadly descriptive function, that's what it's all about, descriptive function of language. This allows for other things, like expressive functions of language, particularly around expressivity of modality, an expressive approach to modality, morality, and things like that. And I'll talk about modality mostly. And Amie Thomasson has written a wonderful book on this where she basically really draws out the notion of modal normativism, all right? So first we're going to just set the tone by talking about this notion of use conditions, right? So if you believe in meanings, they account for our contents, right? They basically are what give us the contents of the things that we say. But when we talk about meaning, we usually intend one of two related notions, right? There's what I call meaning sub one, which is what's picked out or literally said, right, by what I'm saying. So my uttering me means Shannon Bain, right? Mean sub one, Shannon Bain, right? And then there's meaning sub two, and this is how the expression's rules of use determine its meaning sub one, right? In any context, given its linguistic function. So, me being a conventional device for automatically picking out the speaker, means sub two that any utterance of me means the speaker, whoever that is, right? Okay, so here's some examples. In Indexicals, right? The meaning of I, uttered by me, is a function picking out, or just is, depending on how you want to put it, right? Shannon Bain, right? The meaning sub two of I is the rule that I always picks out the speaker, more or less, right? Let's just squint. For names, the meaning of Cary Grant in our context, right, is the function that always delivers, or just is, Cary Grant. The meaning sub two of Cary Grant, given that it's a person name, and this is important, given that it's a type of name, a person name, right, is the convention affording direct designation of the person that was the target of that at the founding of that convention, right? Sentences, my uttering I'm on fire means someone that Shannon Bain, this person, right, actually person, is among the items currently ablaze, while I'm on fire means sub two that the utterer, whoever that is among the items ablaze at the time of utterance, whenever that is, right? It's a pretty straightforward distinction between these two types of meaning, right? But puzzles and arbitrary limitations arise when we assume two things, right? And these are two distinct assumptions that are made in sort of the official story, right? The only cognitively or behaviorally impactful convention meaning or conventional meaning derived content is associated with meaning sub one, right? That's the usual approach. That's the cognitively and significant type of content is the meaning sub one, right? And then the other assumption is that the only cognitively or behaviorally impactful convention meaning derived content is truth conditional, right? Or functionally descriptive, right? This is pretty much the orthodox approach. These are the assumptions behind the orthodox approach. Consider my uttering I'm bored now, right? The meaning sub one of one in context would be something like that Shannon Bain, the actual person, is bored at this time, right? 11:29 Central European Time, February 19th, 2023. Right? The boldface contextual items, and that's the convention I'm going to use, boldface means the things from the context, right? Are actually part of the truth conditions, right? So any situation in which Shannon Bain is bored at 11:29, et cetera, is one of which the meaning sub one is descriptively correct or true. Descriptively correct is a phrase that Kaplan coined in the Meaning of Ouch and Oops talk that was unpublished, right? So that's his way of saying it's basically a way to create a normative way to discuss truth conditions, right? So descriptively correct, okay? Now consider overhearing one from the next room. Given you have no access to who spoke when, you don't have access to the official content, all right? But intuitively, given your semantic competence, i.e. your grasp of one's meaning sub 2, right? You know what's required of any context in which one would be uttered truly. All right? So what you know is something like that the utterer of one is bored at the time of utterance of one. All right? And that comes just from your semantic competence, just from understanding the meaning. Right? Any context meaning three's conditions is a context in which one's meaning, sub 1, in that context would be descriptively correct or true. Okay? So Kaplan, in his unpublished Meaning of Ouch and Oops, calls 3 one's semantic information, right? Or the set of contexts in which one uttered in that context is descriptively correct for that context, or of that context. Korta and Perry call 3 one's fully reflexive content, or the truth conditions of the utterance itself. There are slight differences, but they amount to the same thing, right? 3 amounts to a cognitively or behaviorally impactful information that's not official content, right? So now we're going to talk about something else. We're going to move on. We've established, right? From fully reflexive content to bias. Bias is Predelli's idea, right? So we have 2 notions of broadly truth-conditional content. These are still notions of truth-conditional content, right? Associated with our 2 notions of meaning. There's official content, which is often thought of as the function picking out the set, or actually just the set itself, of circumstances of evaluation, or worlds if you're into that kind of thing, at which the utterances contextually determined meaning sub 1 is true or descriptively correct, i.e. the proposition, right? Reflexive content can be thought of as the set of contexts of utterance at which the uttered expression's meaning sub 2 would, normative, determine a meaning sub 1 true or descriptively correct of its context of utterance, okay? Clearly, Kaplan's notion of character is really important here, right? Character is that aspect of an expression's meaning that accounts for its context's contribution to its referential or official truth-conditional content, right? Character is a flavor of meaning sub 2. It is not the only flavor of meaning sub 2, right? Formally, character is a function from context to contents. It's intended to capture a very narrow notion of indexicality, right? It's the kind of indexicality that epitomized by sort of the direct contextual engagement that expressions like I, here, and now have that relate to, speaker, location, and time of context, right? Okay. But there are distinct aspects of conventional meaning and thus associated informational content distinctions, all right, that are not truth conditional, right, and that character does not capture, right? Consider expressives like alas in alas, I'm bored now, or the proximity distinctions in that house is on fire versus this house is on fire, okay? The fully reflexive content of 4 would be something like the set of contexts meeting the following condition, which is just the truth conditional condition, right, the truth conditions. That the utterer of 4 is bored at the time of the utterance of 4, right? Which is the same reflexive content as is without the expressive, right? So reflexive content as the truth conditions for the utterance doesn't obviously capture the non-truth conditional contribution of alas. Similarly, if this same house is targeted, right? All that you can get from the truth of this, assuming direct reference from either of these sentences, that the target of that house is on fire at the time of the utterance, that target of this house is on fire at the time of utterance, would be the same set of contexts if it was the same house, right? But there's clearly in some readings and in many readings, and it's part of the conventional meaning that there is a relative proximity aspect to the meaning here that could be captured, right? Assuming direct reference, in which case all the demonstrative delivered is the target, the intuitive proximity aspect is just not captured by reflexive content. Stefano Predelli calls the non-truth conditional aspects of conventional meaning bias, okay? And that's just a catch-all term that he uses, right? Bias is complementary to character. He takes meaning of an expression to be a function of both the character and the bias, right? Some things can be character null and all bias. Some things can be bias null and all character, right? Bias is formulated use-conditionally. It's a very simple notion of use conditions as the set of contexts of correct use of the expression, right? Let's look at 4 to get a sense of how it might work, right? So, alas, I'm bored now. So if my daughter Elsa utters 4 at 10:48 CET, February 24th, The structured proposition might be something like this ordered group here. Board, Elsa, February, etc., right? And it's pronounced, obviously, that Elsa is bored or be bored at February 24th at 10:48 p.m., right? In some relatively obvious sense that's still contentious for some reason, right? The proposition determines coarse-grained truth conditions, right? Along the lines of what Elsa utters in context is true if and only if the speaker of context, Elsa, right, is bored at the time of utterance, right? These are very coarse-grained truth conditions. Formulating using the familiar semantic value notion, right, with semantic value with regard to a context C and circumstance of evaluation, which is an ordered pair of a world and a time, right? You get something like the semantic value of 4 in regard to context C, WT, etc., is true if and only if the semantic value of I is an element of the semantic value of bored, right? Basically, this comes down to if the speaker is bored, the agent of the context is among the bored things at that world, right? The intention of the utterance, which again can be a bad word to some people, right? In context is frequently offered as a very coarse-grained alternative to the proposition, right? I'm not going to get into the politics of the intention versus proposition thing. It really let's just say that the intention approximates the proposition right now, okay? So the intention is a set of all circumstances of evaluation at which the semantic value of 4 with regard to context C is true, okay? So this can be formulated as 4's character applied to a context C, right? So the character of 4 at C is the set of all circumstances of evaluation at which the semantic value of 4 in context C with regard to WT is true. Effectively, the set of all circumstances of evaluation in which the agent is bored, all right? This allows us to formulate, very roughly, reflexive content, right? Because then we can say that reflexive content, right, or fully reflexive content, is the set of all contexts, remember Kaplan's version of this, set of all contexts at which the character of 4 at the circumstance of evaluation of the context, right, is true, okay? So, effectively, that's the set of all contexts at which the agent of context is bored at context. All right? So that's a very simple version of reflexive content, right?
Can I make a very short question for
Sure.
So that would be equivalent to, for example, Spellinger's diagonal proposition?
It is very similar to diagonal proposition, except that it assumes, I'll get into this later, but it assumes a set language, right? Diagonal proposition does not assume a set language, so it can be those words can mean anything along the diagonal. But this basically bounds that to a set space along the diagonal, right? Make sense? Okay, all right. This is the set of contexts in which the agent uttering 4 is bored at the time. To Kaplan, this is the set of contexts in which 4 is descriptively correct, all right? So far, we've completely ignored alas, right? That's why we started this. It's not clear what its truth-conditional impact would be. That's why, right? Alas seems to indicate that the speaker is displeased about their boredom. But if we found that they weren't actually displeased, like if we learned more about their actual attitude, their attitudinal feelings, right? We wouldn't say that 4 was false. We just say that the use of alas was weird, right? They didn't understand what it meant, right? Or that it was inappropriate, something like that. Or they were being ironic, right? It has semantic input insofar as it does suggest the displeasure of the speaker regarding the content, right? But it does not have its character null, effectively, right? But alas clearly contributes to 4's meaning, and thus it should contribute to its full content, not just its meaning sub 1 content, but its full content, its meaning sub 2 content. Specifically, alas indicates that for 4 to be correct, appropriate, whatever, the speaker of the context must be displeased about their boredom. Okay, alas then is character neutral, right? Contributing nothing to the truth conditional content. Not all words that have biases are character neutral. They can be mixed, but we're just focusing on a simple case now. But alas does contribute a condition on contexts of correct, appropriate, felicitous, legitimate, however you want to say it, use of the expression, right? Okay, so if following Predelli, we call the context of correct use for 4 CU4, right? The context of correct use for 4 would be the set of all contexts at which the agent is displeased that the agent is bored at that context, right? We could get fancy with this and turn it into one of those Castaneda things. Don't need to. I think this is enough. That is the context for use for all those contexts in which the agent is displeased about their boredom. Okay? All right? Given that alas appears to be an operator on content, right? For's contexts of correct use are a proper subset of the reflexive content, right? Or a proper subset of the context in which for would determine a true official content and context. This is not always the case. It's often the intersection if they're not a function, not an operator on content, but in this case it is. So it looks like that the bias content, the use-conditional content, the contexts of correct use are a subset of the reflexive content in this particular case, right? So intuitively, this is a sort of content or information derivable from for's meaning sub 2 alone, if we expand it to include bias, right? Understanding for's meaning sub 2 is distinguishing between those contexts in which for will be uttered both truthfully and appropriately, and those in which it would be inappropriate or false, all right? This is a narrowing of the informational space, pretty obviously a narrowing of informational space, meaning it's cognitively significant, so it's content, right? But the context of use of for is also a fuller notion of content than we had with either the propositional or reflexive content, right? Finally, if you know enough about the actual context, specifically whether it meets the, the use conditions associated with for, then you know whether for is actually true and appropriate because it's a subset of the reflexive content. You know the truth because it's in the context of correct use, you know it's appropriate, all right? So now that we have that away, let's move back a little bit, right? And also, this was 2 papers. That was the first paper. I'm going to bridge the 2 and go to the second, right? Connections to non-descriptive functions, right? Fully reflexive content was originally posited as, among many other things, and Kepa, I'm sure you'll tell me I'm wrong about this, a way of addressing semantic paradoxes arising from within the direct reference tradition, while maintaining that tradition's broadly descriptive or representational intuitions about truth and reference, right? But if our discussion so far makes sense, right, reflexive content is arguably, like bias, a form of use-conditional content specifying conditions of descriptive correctness for an expression's use, right? It's normative. It's a correctness condition, right? Descriptive correctness conditions are a way of accommodating truth-conditional aspects of conventional meaning in a use-conditional, what I call idiom, right? Just a use-conditional way of talking about it. Similarly, bias is a way of capturing the non-truth-conditional aspects of conventional meaning as a non-descriptive, right, conditions on context of correct use. And by non-descriptive, I simply mean not involving narrowly representational semantic notions of truth and reference, right? It's broader than that. Stepping back even further, right, what this allowed us to do was articulate a version of the philosophically dominant, it's what we normally think about, right, when we're doing philosophical semantics, dominant descriptive function of language associated with traditional semantic notions, right, in a simple use-conditional idiom. But this allows us to approach and analyze other non-descriptive functions, e.g. expressive functions, right, as first-class citizens without torturing the base semantics, right? The base semantics has them as a first-class citizen. You don't have to turn a truth-conditional semantic into something that can accommodate non-truth-conditional. You just start non-truth-conditional, describe descriptive correctness conditions as another type of condition on context, right? For me, reflexive content is the bridge concept crossing the chasm between unifunctional approaches and multifunctional approaches, which are much more realistic to the way language works and the way our brains work too, I think. I mean, consideration of functions beyond the descriptive defines much of the discussion, and this is where I get into pragmatics, right? Pragmatism, not even pragmatics, right? Consideration of functions beyond the descriptive defines much of the discussion of modality, in particular among neo and even just new pragmatists, right? For example, Simon Blackburn, Hugh Price, Robert Brandom regularly explicate modal notions via expressive functions, right? In particular, Brandom's most famous discussion of this is around what he calls the Kant-Sellers thesis, which is effectively that modal vocabulary makes explicit commitments and abilities already implicit in the use of ordinary non-modal language, right? So our ability to properly use regular old descriptive talk, right, already assumes all the commitments that we then make explicit through modal locutions, okay? Working in this tradition, Amie Thomasson has recently presented a very well-articulated, well-thought-out modal normativist account of specifically metaphysical modality, right? And this is metaphysical modality, not causal, physical, nomological, whatever other kind of modality you want to talk about, right? What makes Thomasson's account normativist, right? And what does that mean? She presents metaphysical modal vocabulary as an object language means of presenting and negotiating norms of use for non-modal vocabulary. All right? She rejects modal truth makers like possible worlds, potentialities, dispositions, etc. That descriptive accounts seem to require. They tend to require something that makes the thing true, right, outside of language, right? And she provides an epistemically straightforward and broadly generalizable account of metaphysical modality that works as well for less descriptively straightforward or descriptively physically definable entities like statues, teams, persons, as it does for more easily descriptively definable stuff like marble or material or lump of clay, right? Or individuals or bodies, right? Let's take a look at what this means. So reflexive content and use conditions and metaphysical modality. All right. Here's her approach to, this is just a summary of what she thinks modal normativism is. It's the function of having metaphysical modal vocabulary is that it enables speakers to convey semantic rules or their consequences, that's important, in particularly useful ways while remaining in the object language, and that's important, right? It does not, it's in conditions of semantic descent, not ascent, okay? On Thomasson's account, metaphysical modal vocabulary has a regulative, normative rather than a descriptive role. Its function is not to describe some modal reality, right? It's to negotiate and discuss and present in the object language the rules of language. Right? It allows us to express, illustrate, and renegotiate semantic and conceptual rules and boundaries without ascending, right? And it also provides a clearer modal epistemology, a less eccentric modal ontology, right? And it just generalizes better. Okay? So instead of requiring truth makers for modal expressions in this or other possible worlds, Thomasson's account leverages application rules which indicate when a kind term, sortal, or name applies to something, right? And then also co-application rules, and these are the important ones for counterfactual, subjunctive language, right? Indicating when we would reapply names, kinds, or sortals to the same entity across counterfactual scenarios. Right? And then she has these these rules can either be language rules, statable in terms of other terms in the language, or world language rules, right? And these require some sort of empirical input or ostensive input, right? Empirical investigation or ostensive definition. Okay, in this way, she helps provide a unified approach, right, that accounts both for modal truths with seemingly obvious worldly truth makers, like the marble this statue is made of can survive shattering, right, as well as those that aren't sufficiently accountable in purely physical descriptive terms, like the marble statue cannot survive smashing. Same substance, same situation of smashing, different modal profiles, metaphysical modal profiles, right? Okay, though often glossed over, Kripke's famous examples of de re and de posteriori necessity have very particular structures, right? They are conditional, right? So if P is the case, or given P, necessarily P, right? They typically involve identity ascriptions or their consequences. So if or given that water is actually H2O, water cannot not be H2O, right? If or given that Cary Grant is actually Archie Leach, Cary Grant is necessarily Archie Leach. And according to Kripke, these a posteriori identity statements have what he calls the peculiar character of mathematical propositions, right? Though we may lack the requisite skill to compute them, we do know a priori that if they are true, they are necessarily true, right? Philosophical analysis tells us that a posteriori necessities cannot be contingently true, so any empirical knowledge of the truth is automatically empirical knowledge that they are necessary. This is a quote from the addendum to naming a necessity. Right? One way to interpret this, and not the only way obviously, but one way to interpret this is just as we know of mathematical propositions, right, that their truth follows from the rules of mathematics, and thus we know a priori of any mathematical proposition that if it is true, right, it cannot be contingently true. Right? We know automatically of any a posteriori necessity statement that if true, it must be true, given that the truth follows from how identity ascriptions work for various terms in counterfactual scenarios. Right? Given the terms, quote unquote, rules of application and reapplication or co-application across counterfactuals. So this might be what Mackey was getting at in 1974 in his reply to Kripke, right? When he said that though these necessities apply to individual things and natural kinds, that they do so apply is primarily a feature of the way we think and speak of how we handle identity in association with counterfactual possibility. They reflect implicit rules for the ascription of identity, for the recognition of the same person or thing or stuff or species in neutrally described, merely possible situations. I would go further and say that these implicit rules define what is an appropriate or inappropriate subjunctive given the terms used, right? Okay, Thomasson holds that the function of modal vocabulary is to express, discuss, and debate these implicit rules explicitly in the object language. Okay, so consider this vase could not survive shattering. On the possible worlds account, 12 is true because there's no possible world in which this very vase, or its counterpart if you're a Lewisian, right, survives shattering. But possible worlds as truth makers lead to some complication, confusion, right? Invite serious questions about our epistemic access to them. How do we know what goes on in other possible worlds, right? It's not clear why what's the case in other worlds has anything to do with this world, as Salmon back in the 70s pointed out, right? Or back in the early 80s pointed out. Trans-world identity of relevant entities isn't a super clear notion, right? To say the least. And it's seemingly ontologically extravagant, like we have enough world here, right? If we take them at face value, okay? Another account seeks truth makers in this world, usually potentialities or dispositions, right? Those are the things that are in the literature most popularly. This is what's called sort of like a hardcore modal realist approach. So in this case, 12 is true because it expresses a modal fact accounted for by the vase's modal properties. Because the vase has a modally relevant property we might call fragility, where fragility is accounted for by a physical modally relevant property of the glass, like brittleness, right? Situations of shattering are not ones that this vase survives, all right? Clearly, being able to track physically or causally modally relevant facts and properties in the world is true. We do that, right? And is survival relevant and thus likely something we actually do, right? But while 12 states a modal fact, 13 doesn't, right? The glass this vase is made of could not survive shattering. Because its brittle glass will shatter, but it remains glass, right? The metaphysical question is, the thing that goes through it, when do you reapply the sortal or kind term, right? So the physical situations are identical when the glass and the vase shatter. But the vase and the glass have very distinct metaphysical modal profiles, okay? Thus, dispositional properties, while physically and causally modally relevant, right, to the shattering, right, are insufficient to account for the vase's metaphysical modal profile, all right? That is how it survives or doesn't survive as the same vase across counterfactual situations. So, and there doesn't really seem to be a good argument from a purely physical standpoint that suffices for the metaphysical distinction, not the causal or physical distinction. All right? At least I haven't seen it, right? This is, Jackson calls it the location problem, right? Hugh Price calls it the placement problem. Peacock had another word for it that I can't remember, right? On the modal normativist account, vase has application and co-application conditions, or rules, indicating when we may apply or reapply to the same entity or refuse, deny application of the term, right? So the rules determine metaphysical modal profile, i.e. the bounds of use of the term across the sorts of counterfactual situations relevant both to that term and to metaphysical modal concepts, okay? And then she introduces an introduction and elimination rules, right? The introduction rule necessarily applies to P whenever P either is or is a consequence of an object language instance of one of the rules. And then elimination rule is when necessarily legitimately applies to P, we may assume or hold P steady across counterfactual situations, okay? We have something like a Riley inference ticket at this point. All right. In simple cases, Thomasson proceeds from semantic or conceptual rules. I don't like those words, but that's what we got to deal with, right? To some information about the situation in an object language instance to the rule of a legitimate modal claim, right? So the rule, vase, is not to be reapplied after shattering. Okay? Object language instance of the rule, given that vase applies, this vase does not survive shattering. Modal, given that vase applies, necessarily this vase does not survive shattering, and our modal there is equivalent to this vase could not survive shattering, which is our 12, right? Could we think of rule as above? Now here's where we get into use conditions. Is there a way to think about this use conditionally through our use conditional lens, right? Could we think of rule above as a condition on context of correct use? But in this case, what does context of correct use mean, right? Use conditions are often used to account for expressives, like identifying the attitudinal, right, conditions the context must meet. With Predelli, we extended the idea to account for non-truth conditional contributions generally, like this and that, right, by identifying contextual conditions relating to relative proximity. And you could do the same with buts. You could do the same with all kinds of conventional implicatory type things, right? Reflexive content, like I showed, is profitably viewed as conditions on descriptively correct use, right? Thomasson's semantic or conceptual rules can be cast as contexts of correct actual use. Here's where we get into diagonalization, okay? Of the expression. The contextual conditions specifying the expression's correct use as it is actually used, here from the actual world. So it is both the diagonal, but constrained to a language, right? Okay, as opposed to counterfactually used. So the actual language appropriate context of use for vase must meet the following condition, among many others, obviously. But the context of use for vase are that, and I can show you, like, if you guys want, I'll show you the formalizations of all this. I can send you the paper, right? That vase applies only if the object it applies to is not shattered, right? This is one of the many conditions of correct use of vase, right? The word vase could have meant something different, right? That something that potentially could have survived shattering, right? But in the context correct for the language we're actually speaking, vase means, among many other things, something that could not survive shattering, right? So removing the modal from 12, we get our object language sentence from her way of doing it, right? This vase does not survive shattering. Among the contexts of use for 13 would be those meeting the following conditions: that the object targeted by this vase is a vase only if the object targeted by this vase is not shattered. This is an instance of the conditions of use of, or the context of use for vase, right? So this is effectively context of use of 13 are a subset of the context of use of vase, right? On Thomasson's view, the function of metaphysical modal vocabulary is to express or illustrate the bounds or constraints of use, right, on the expressions and consequences across counterfactual situations in the object language. So modal vocabulary gives us the ability to explicitly talk about, renegotiate, etc., semantic constraints on correct use in the object language. But she agrees with Michael Williams' contention that expressive function does not exclude some form of propositional content. So it's truth evaluable, right? So it's both expressive and truth evaluable. How do we do that? To get the propositions, because expressives have issues with, like particularly the Frege-Geach problem, where how do you embed an expressive in an argument if it has no truth value and just a moral statement just means yuck, right? How does that have a truth value? So how can you argue with it, right? So she needs to do, if from her version, have an expressive, figure out a way to go from expressive to proposition. So she uses what's called Schiffer's pleonastic inferences to get the propositions. So S is an indicative sentence. This is the way you derive one of these easy inferences to a proposition. Since S is an indicative sentence, we're licensed to derive the proposition that S, right? The proposition that S is guaranteed to refer regardless of S's truth or falsity. This is called a pleonastic inference, or an easy inference, as Thomas calls it, right? With the proposition in hand, we can use any one of a number of deflationary accounts of truth to get a truth value for modal claims. I like Blackburn's account. I'm not going to go into the details, all right? We can talk about it later. Okay, to some, pleonastic inferences feel like a cheat. They're just too easy. So, but from our use-conditional perspective, we don't appear to need pleonastic inferences to get the proposition, okay? Given the use-conditional approach and Thomasson's idea that modal vocabulary makes rules of use for the expressions involved explicit in the object language, right? 12's reflexive content, which means we have a proposition, right, is effectively something like that the object targeted by this vase meets the application conditions for vase, and there is no context of the same correct use of vase in which the object is shattered and still meets the application conditions for vase, right? Reflexive conditions for 12 is the condition any context of utterance must meet for what 12 expresses in that context to be true in that context, right? So 12 is true in any context if the targeted object meets the application conditions for vase and holding these conditions steady, holding these application conditions steady, right? Constraining ourselves to CU vase, right? Context of use of vase. If the object were shattered, it would no longer meet those application conditions, okay? This seems like a perfectly clear condition on any context for 12 to be true. So 12 appears to be a proposition and be truth evaluable, right? And given our use-conditional approach and reflexive content in particular, modal expressions can have an expressive function, meaning that they express or illustrate the correct use of the expression in the object language, yet be truth evaluable, without having to rely on pleonastic inferences, right? Thus, like Thomas's account, we overcome the Frege-Geach problem without expressives embedded in argument forms, but without relying on pleonastic inferences, okay? Next, we'll consider a posteriori necessary expressions. So consider whatever is water is H2O, whatever is water is necessarily H2O. All right. Some of Thomasson's application and co-application conditions, application rules, are schematic or world deferential rules. They have an open slot, right? This is something Alan Siddell talked about a long time ago in conventionalism, about his approach to modal conventionalism, right? They have an open slot for some worldly fact to complete the application and co-application conditions, right? They still have a meaning sub 2. That meaning sub 2 is it requires this kind of thing. And then you put it in the world and you figure out what that kind of thing is, and then you have the full conditions, right? So kind terms like water are specific cases of a more general or higher level sort called a chemical kind term, right? Chemical kind terms assume, let's say, a shared microstructure for all items to which that term applies, right? Water, as a chemical kind term, is to be applied to anything having whatever microstructure water actually has. Discovering the microstructure requires empirical investigation, but whatever it is, it's part of the full application and co-application conditions of water, okay? So recalling our terminology from earlier, right? The meaning sub 2 of a chemical kind term like water assumes there is a specific type. This is part of the meaning sub 2. So it has a meaning, it's just not descriptive in any sense, right? The meaning sub 2 of a chemical kind term like water assumes there is a specific type of worldly fact that fully determines the meaning sub 1. But what that fact is not part of the meaning sub 2, right? This is distinctive of meaning sub 2 of chemical kind terms. This is how they work, right? We tend to think of these, water is a specific type of kind term. Animal is another specific type of kind term, right? Vase is a artifactual kind term, or sortal, not even kind term, right? So they have these hierarchical structure of more general, more specific, right? And the general one puts conditions on the kinds of things that they can be, and therefore the metaphysical facts, modal metaphysical facts, right? 14, are whatever is water is H2O, right? Has Kripke's peculiar character, right? We know a priori that if 14 is true, 15 is true. That necessarily water is H2O. Arguably because we know how chemical kind terms work in identity sentences. We know that if it's an identity sentence with the kind term on one side and a microstructure term on the other, if it's true, it's necessarily so. Because that's how chemical kind terms work. Once we know the microstructure required by the meaning sub 2, we have the completed semantic rule, which is necessary. Remember, introduction rule I. Right? But since a worldly fact is required to fully determine the application and co-application conditions, it's a posteriori. Right? Breaking it down in our use-conditional idiom. If K is some chemical kind term, the context of use for K would include all those contexts meeting the condition that there is a microstructural property P such that K applies to a substance if and only if that substance has P. Right? For the specific chemical kind term water, we get an instance of the rule, i.e. the subset of contexts, and this is a subset of contexts, meeting the context of correct use of K, that also meet that there is a microstructural property P such that water applies to a substance if and only if that substance has P. Right? 14 then tells us what empirically discovered microstructural property our chemical kind water actually has, providing what the meaning sub 2 of water requires to fully specify its application and co-application conditions. The filled-in schematic for water is effectively Korta and Perry's fully reflexive content for 14. The subset of the context of use of water meeting the following condition, that any substance to which the chemical kind term water legitimately applies is a substance having the chemical microstructure specified by H2O. Okay? If we constrain ourselves to the reflexive content of 14, which is the set of context of use of water as we use it in the actual context in which 14 is true, we get 15 naturally. Right? That is, given that the microstructure actually completing the application conditions, meaning sub 2, of water is H2O, we can't use water the same way we actually use it, and it's not H2O. Okay? Thus, the reflexive content of 15 would be something like that. Any substance to which the chemical kind term water legitimately applies is a substance having the chemical microstructure specified by H2O, and there is no context of the same correct use of water in which any substance to which the chemical content water legitimately applies is not a substance having the chemical microstructure specified by H2O. Okay? Modal normativism, through a use-conditional lens, makes it really, or a little bit easier anyway, to see what can lead to confusion about de re and a posteriori metaphysical necessities. And remember, we're talking about metaphysical necessity, right? The meaning sub 2 of certain terms don't fully specify their application conditions. We all know that, right? Meaning sub 2 does, however, specify what type of thing the world needs to provide to completely specify them. And we do know a priori that if anything has it, whatever that needed thing is, it has it necessarily, right? The way the world happens to be, the specifics of the context we're in, right, are in many ways contingent, right? But once completed with the facts that actually hold, the application conditions are set. That's what the term actually means. And any correct use requires the application conditions to be met. All right, this is deflated metaphysical necessity. All right? It's what follows from using the terms as they happen to actually be used. And this also makes it really easy to see why S5 is widely considered the metaphysically correct modal frame, right? The same marks or sounds could have been used to mean some different microstructural property had the context been different, right? But constraining ourselves to actual use in the actual context, they can't not mean what they actually do and be the same term. This also allows us to make some more sense of so-called obstinate rigidity. Okay? This is Salmon's idea that rigid designators like names designate the reference even in situations in which those references don't exist. Okay? Consider Cary Grant as Archie Leach and necessarily Cary Grant as Archie Leach. 16 is Cary Grant as Archie Leach. 17, necessarily Cary Grant as Archie Leach, right? Arguably, the set of contexts of utterance delimiting the correct use of person names will include those meeting the conditions that when X equals Y, any name legitimately applied to X may be legitimately applied to Y. Okay? An instance of an actual person name like Cary Grant, right, would place the following additional condition on constraints of correct person name use. Right? So a subset of CU name would be context of use of Cary, that when X equals Y, if Cary Grant legitimately applies to X, Cary Grant legitimately applies to Y. There'd be the same one for Archie Leach, right? 16's reflexive content would be that the person legitimately designated by the use of Cary Grant, the Cary Grant convention, is the person legitimately designated by the use of this Archie Leach convention, right? This holds among that subset of contexts in the intersection of the correct use of Cary Grant and correct use of Archie Leach, right? In which those names legitimately designate the same individual. Thus, the reflexive content of 17 looks something like that the person legitimately designated by the use of this Cary Grant convention is the person legitimately designated by the use of this Archie Leach convention. And there is no context of the same correct use of these name conventions in which the person actually legitimately designated by the use of Cary Grant is not the person actually legitimately designated by the use of Archie Leach. Okay? The debate around obstinate rigidity makes sense only if you're a modal descriptivist. Right? If your modal expressions describe other worlds or alternate physical states of this world, it seems odd to say 16 has a value in a situation in which Cary Grant doesn't exist. Right? But if you're a modal normativist, constraining ourselves to the context in which names in 16 are used as they actually are, there's no context in which those very name conventions don't mean one, right? Doesn't mean sub one, the individual they're actually attached to. That means their meaning sub two has actually been completed by the same individual in the actual world, right? So they always pick out the same individual in any context of actually correct use and any circumstance of evaluation accessible from those contexts. Okay? And this is so even if we suppose the individuals to not exist, right? Not the context of use, but you know what I mean. If, however, we're supposing something expressible as, what if the actual context had been different? Well, then they would have picked out a different individual or not been identical, or depending on the nature of the counterfactual, right? But their meaning sub two, though identical in the parts not requiring completion by the world, meaning that it has to be a person, they came from the same genetic, blah, 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 et cetera, right? So there's conditions on person name, right? They'd have to meet those. That's part of the meaning sub two of names. Would have defined a distinct set of contexts and correct use relative to those counterfactual situations, they would have picked out different people. They would have different rules of application completed by the facts of the actual context of use, right? However, the range of variation of the relevant real counterfactual contexts is determined by the names gappy, meaning sub two. Gappy in the sense that meaning sub two assumes that there's some completion by the world, all right? That sums it up. That's my talk. Questions?
Do you want me to moderate? You moderate yourself, right?
What's that?
You moderate.
Sure, I can moderate the hell out of myself. What do we need? Anybody got any questions? I'm sure there have to be some questions. Or maybe not. Yes, of course.
I have the argument. Thanks for the talk. I start with a clarificatory question because there is something big I think I didn't understand.
Okay.
What is what you call the official content? No. What is the official content of a sentence like necessarily be?
Necessarily.
Yeah,
Okay.
I got the reflexive content bit
Right.
and all of that, but I didn't get what the official content in your view is.
That's the thing, is that for things like officially be on the modal normativist viewpoint, right? On Thomasson's view, right? Is that there really isn't an official content in the same sense in which there is an official content, like a truth-conditional content. There can be truth applied to it, and the truth is valuable, right? But there's an expressive content, which is basically saying the reflexive content, right? And then in a context, like, or in a world, I can say, oh yes, this world is, the context of use in this world is the same as, it's within the context of use of this, right? So it's appropriate and true. It meets the application conditions for vase, right? And using it correctly, if we continue to use it correctly, there's no way I could use it and it wouldn't mean this, right? So that is there is no official content in the same sense in which there is for a non-modal sentence.
Just for the sentences with modal operators, or for
Right.
all sentences?
From modal operators.
Only for those.
As far as I
So,
know. That's my understanding of her view, yes.
And you share it?
To a certain extent, I'm still working it out. I do think that there is something there very valuable, right, about, I don't think there have to be descriptive truth conditions associated with it the way there are for a lot of non-modal sentences, right? There's a descriptive component to it in that the vase has to meet the application conditions for vase, right? There's that part. But that's the non-modal part, right? And then there is the part that modalizes it, which is that, right. And so there's an aspect of truth, of official content to it, if it's a descriptive sentence. But what makes it a modal sentence doesn't really have a lot to do with the descriptive part, right?
Can I follow up?
Of course.
What about then a sentence, a conditional, for example, where, okay, you mentioned something like that, where the antecedent doesn't have the modal operator and the consequent does have it.
Mm-hmm.
So if Hesperus is phosphorus, then necessarily Hesperus is phosphorus,
Mm-hmm.
where you want, of course, the operator operating on the consequent.
Mm-hmm.
Then it's difficult to say whether there is an official content expressed by this conditional, because in a sense the first part has an official content,
Mm-hmm.
the second doesn't have an official
It has
content.
a dimension
So
of, it has a dimension of official content, right? Which is the non-modalized part. It's the same as the first part, right? Hesperus is phosphorus, and then there's Hesperus is phosphorus, necessarily Hesperus is phosphorus again, right? So basically saying like, Hesperus is phosphorus, fact. If we continue to use Hesperus and phosphorus the same way, it's necessary, right? In the sense that that's what Hesperus and phosphorus mean, well, necessarily. It is sort of, I mean, and it does give you that feeling of like, well, then you're not really saying anything when you're saying something is necessary. What you're saying is, as she says, you're just making explicit what was implicit in that identity statement, right? So, just like Brandon would have said, right? But he was talking mostly about causal physical necessity, right?
Thanks.
No problem.
I think so. So it's not a question, it's the sense of
Oddness.
like you loosen the subject matter somehow. Like it's not there. Because if you listen to the scriptic aspect, when you talk about necessity or contingency or whatever,
Right.
then you're not really talking about anything. If there's no official content, you're not adding anything.
Right.
You're just saying the same thing, Hesperus and phosphorus.
Right.
You're just now saying you cannot
Use
use those terms in other sense. But there's a feeling, that remaining feeling, that I think is maybe what's behind the other thing. Like, yeah, but I'm actually saying something else. I'm saying that, you know, they're one and the same object. They cannot be.
Right.
So I'm talking about
Exactly.
the planet. I'm not talking about the concept.
Right. And Thomasson does address that, because you are still, you're saying, you're using it, right, in the object language.
Yeah.
And she avoids the use-mention shift, right, by saying we're still talking about these things, right, but when we shift to modal discourse, we shift to modal vocabulary, that is a way of speaking that changes everything, right? That way of speaking really is just like, oh, that's what these things are. We've said that these are the same thing, right? That's how we use these terms. And so it's still about the objects, right? What we were really saying is like, what's the informational there is that, oh, it's not the trivial information that Venus is Venus, right? It's the factual information that this word actually means this thing. These words mean the same thing, right? They mean the same thing. And so I've always had that feeling, and I'm torn in both directions, right? There is the sense in which we're talking about the thing, but it's only from a very cut and dry, direct reference mentality, right, that we see that the informational content of that sentence, the official content, is Venus, which it clearly isn't. Part of it is, a dimension of it is, right? But then another dimension is that the information conveyed by knowing how language works, and it's just as valid as the official content, is that I'm informing you that there's a single referent for both of those words, right? And that's what they mean, and there's no way you can use them, given that they mean the same thing, in a way that makes them mean something different if you're using them correctly. Does that make sense? Okay, cool. And that's what I'm taking to be her view. And she does, there's a lot of questions like that. You do feel that oddness, right? The same with her ontology. You feel like it's this easy ontology. And we, coming from our background in like direct reference and metaphysics, feel, oh, there's something missing, right? But then if you switch back to the pragmatist viewpoint and the pragmatist tradition, you're like, oh, this is what they've been talking about the whole time. We just never realized it. They've been saying there's an expressive function to modal language. It's really talking about conceptual connections, interconnections, and material logic, not formal or formalized logic, inferential relationships, right? Make sense? Any other questions?
Well, I have a couple of comments, questions.
Cool.
Yeah, I like the first. The picture,
Of course.
These things can mesh and explain each other better. That's good news. I have a question, well, I don't know, just a comment on the word context. For me, sometimes it's a bit confusing. Talking about Kaplan and others, sometimes they haven't made the context of utterance or narrow context, right? With the speaker, agent, space, time, and word, and that's it, right? And other thing, which is not the context of utterance, but the state of affairs
Environment.
described, or what makes true, which is not the context of utterance, but the context of the utterance is trying to denote or to describe or to be expressive about or something. So sometimes when we talk about conditions of correct context, seems to be, they could be not the context of utterance, but the context that should make true the utterance, which are different. Can be different.
And that's why, and that's why Kaplan always separated them out, right? There's the context that gives it the meaning sub one, right? And then there's the thing you compare that to get a truth condition, which is the world-time pair, right? Circumstance of evaluation, right? And so every context has a circumstance of evaluation, right? So what makes it the case that, this is how I think about reflexive, content in the simple way, right? Is that it is true in context, meaning that what it says in the context is true at the circumstance of evaluation of the context, and thereby it is descriptively correct. And that's the way sort of reflexive content's been you and John have really developed it as being sort of like a truth-conditional version of sort of descriptive correctness,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. So now another comment, which is not a criticism or rejection, I mean, just something that shouldn't be my mind thinking about the Kaplan's example, alas, I am bored was the example. Yeah. So it seems to me that in their reflexive conditions you get, you have this part. Everything sounds truth conditional, so we have to be careful, right? Because since you include the fact that the speaker is displeased, right? Mm-hmm. That's another condition. Yes. That's a condition of correctness, right? Or use. Correctness, yeah. Mm-hmm. Somehow articulated by the word alas, right? Yeah. And then the rest gives you a truth condition. Yep. Now, the idea is like, well, what if the same sentence without alas also has conditions of use that are not limited to, and they can include, can have exactly the same conditions of correction that the alas will alas. So maybe it would make sense to talk about unarticulated conditions of use. That's why of the utterance that are not articulated in the sentence, maybe in one case, but are articulated by alas, right? Alas.
But that's why I was focusing on initially. There's two things there. I was focusing on the idea of semantic competence. So just saying the conventional meaning. Here's what comes in the conventional meaning. No, just the words, right? Alas has a conventional meaning. I am bored has a conventional meaning, right? And there's things you could do with it that are completely distinct, right? And then there's also, you could say there are unarticulated constituents with bored, right? That could be the kind of thing that could be somehow, I don't know, conditionally change in its scope depending on how you have if you have an unarticulated constituent or not, right? But just in terms of the basic understanding of basic semantic competence, if you heard I am bored from the other room, you'd know the conditions in which that person, that would be true, under which that would be true, right? If you heard alas, I'm bored, you'd know the conditions under which it would be true, and you know the conditions under which it would be correct and unironically used, right? And those conditions are two dimensions of meaning, right? And the way I put those dimensions together is say like, well, they create sets of contexts, right? One is the descriptively correct context, the truth conditional, right? Set of contexts in which saying that, ironically, unironically, whatever, incorrectly, misusing it, would still be true. You're bored, right? But then there's a subset of that, which is it's both true and appropriate, right? And so then that's how you get those dimensions, right? You narrow your scope. And that's why it's informationally important. That's why, to me, this is part of full content, right? Because it's still informational. You learn something when you hear that you didn't know, right? You've narrowed your scope in a way that if you just heard I am bored, you wouldn't have narrowed your scope, right, of the context in which it would be correctly used, right? So
it would make sense like Austin said, right? There are all sorts of things to consider on the statement beyond its truth. There's being inappropriate, so you can have information giving about the mental states that the speaker should have, or that the speaker thinks about blah blah, or about moral issues. All this could be part of the informational content or use condition of different. Exactly. Some of them will tell you this is false. If that's not mean it's false, the other one will say, well, maybe it can be true, but infelicitus or
And this is what I want to do at some point, right? You talked about Prashant Parikh earlier, right? Yeah. I love both of his books, right? And Robin Clark's great book on game theoretical semantics and pragmatics, right? This is where that comes in. There are some things that are more likely, some contexts that are more central and probable, with a sort of like decreasing probability as you go out from that central set of probable or likely contexts of use, right? So it's not just cut and dry. These are correct, that's incorrect. You can, if you squint, say that, right? You can, these are more correct than those, right? But there's an enormous number of these things. And we do tend to think, I guess for lack of a better word, probabilistically or more game theoretically about the ones that are probably going to be more likely to be the case. Right? Philosophers are really good at sort of developing ridiculous thought experiments in situations that can excuse or allow any sort of phrase. In the real world, we don't do that, right? You know, because we do think in terms of probability or the most likely thing you're trying to say, right? And work our way there. But we do it against a base of meaning, of conventional meaning, right?
That's the same with this house and that house. Reflexive content doesn't capture the non-conditional and the
Proximity aspect.
the proximity aspect. And that, I did read it in your paper before, and I was like, no, that it does capture it, because you have, you know, the house referred to, that speaker refers to by the use of this, or the house that refers to by the use of that. But I guess what, yeah. I don't
But if you overhear it, you know, if you overhear that house is on fire, you run to the window. If you overhear this house on fire, you will run out the door. You know, I mean, and that's and that's the difference, right? And so there is a behavioral and cognitively significant aspect to it that is conventional. It's baked into the proximity, but only in certain contexts, and it can also be metaphorical proximity. Doesn't only have to be physical proximity, right? That's what I was talking about. This is what I'm talking about, right? There's a metaphorical proximity associated with those, right? That isn't a physical or descriptive proximity. So that would be handled with bias as well. So it could have a reflexive. It could. It depends on how you want to use it. It depends on how you identify the meaning, right? If it depends. We have to really work that one out, right? So, any other questions?
People who think that this whole the easy inferences that Thomasson uses, it's not that I have anything against them, but particularly the one with pleonastic propositions. I find it like, no, that's too much, right? But it's probably because I don't understand what a pleonastic proposition is. So I was wondering if you, so one way of thinking about them is just somehow like John and Kepa and it's like, okay, look, these are just like tools, just theoretical tools that you have to capture or to keep track of truth conditions.
Right.
Would that be a pleonastic proposition? No.
I mean, one way to think about it is, yeah, I mean, it's a very deflated notion, a deflationary notion of a proposition, right? Yeah. So all you're really saying is like, well, if it's something we can refer to and talk about and debate and attach probability to and say is true or false and treat as true or false behaviorally and, you know, in our language and in our thought, it's effectively just a proposition, right? And so that's the way Simon Blackburn discusses it, right? So his view is like, well, we have these sort of mental states, these mental attitudes, right, toward certain domains. We have a mental attitude toward the descriptive world, right? And then we express these through commitments we have. And in the ordinary, you know, way of speaking, we express these commitments through things like good, bad, valuable, not valuable, necessary, possible, right? When we're really just saying like, these are the inferences that I buy and I will never buy, right? This is the stuff that, these are the sort of like the deontic rules that I'm committed to, right? And we treat them and speak in the ordinary mode propositionally about them, right? Whether or not there's a descriptive proposition behind them, that's the question. And his view is like, it's quasi-realist. He doesn't really think there's any alternative to quasi-realist. Right? He's like, I don't really see a good realist alternative to the quasi-realism of just saying, these are the things we're committed to, this is the way we talk about them, and this is the way we interact. And it's not an individual thing. It's like our mental attitude shaped by everything around us. Right? And we treat them propositionally. Why not make them propositions? And then their truth or falsity comes down to correctness in whatever conditions those mental states require for their truth or correctness. Right? And so that's a less schematic way to think about an inference that just derives a proposition from just attributive statements, right? So indicative sentences, right?
Does she apply this to, sorry,
Well, she says that one of the deflationary things you can use is Simon Blackburn's version.
Yeah.
And like I love Simon Blackburn.
Yeah.
And so she says in passing. She prefers I think Horwich, who I'm not a fan of. So, go on, Andrea.
I have another word, but I'm really not sure I'm able to express it in full. So, and probably I will be bullshitting a bit.
That's what I've been doing the whole time.
So the one common problem for the traditional semantic framework, for example, adopting the notion of structured propositions, is that, and you mentioned it at some point, I think, or maybe not, that the proposition that Hesper's is bright, this is an abstract object comprising the planet Hesper's and the property of being bright. What about this proposition? Is this proposition necessarily existent? So what if the word didn't contain Hesper's? There would still be the proposition, blah, 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 all this stuff. And of course you get these kind of puzzles, because if you say that the proposition contains the planet or the Mont Blanc or whatever it is. Now, of course, in your view, you don't have anything like that. When we're talking about sentences under the scope of a modal operator, because there are no official propositions containing planets and properties. Right?
There is an element of official content insofar as the non-modal component within it, right?
Okay.
It has to meet those conditions. So Hesperus is Venus, no matter what. In this view, it's always Venus, all right?
Don't you have a similar problem, though, for the words, the expressions? Because your propositions use this. I mean, the sentences used to state them. And so there are words there are expressions.
Yes.
So if those expressions didn't exist, would something puzzling come out? Or not?
Well, no, remember, we're talking, it's similar to the obstinate rigidity thing, right? Once they're there, that's just what we're talking about. We're talking about this vase. Right? It met the application conditions. It has to meet the application conditions. And that object, can't really call it a thing, because a thing is too amorphous for modal normativism. It has to be an object, meaning it has to meet the application conditions of an object, right? So it has to be an object, right? And that object can't be shattered and not be that. But once we're talking about Hesperus, from here, it's always Venus. And it's counterfactually, that's what it means. That's the concept. Right? It's been attached to that. And only if we say, okay, we could have used the word Hesperus differently, right? Then, okay, yeah, you can talk about it being different. Hesperus, the word Hesperus might have never existed. But from here, still Venus, right?
Yeah, and it doesn't pose any problem, the fact that you have the words, the expressions in the truth conditions.
These are in the reflexive truth conditions. That's where reflexive truth conditions tend to be created, right, articulated, right?
In the case of the sentences with the modal operators, it doesn't create a problem because there is still the bit with the object. That's the point.
Right, that's the point. And that's why we say the object that is the target of, or that, the object to which vase applies, right, actually, right? You would never apply that, if that object itself was shattered, you wouldn't apply vase again. And that's how you get the modal aspect of it. So you do have an official content dimension in there. Because you have the thing in there, because you're talking about the object. Right? You're talking about applying this thing meets the application conditions for this concept. Right? If that thing was different, it might not meet those application conditions anymore. Right?
Because I think that I was on the moment. So then, in those cases where you are using, like in the case that Andrea was selling, why do you want to push the reflexive? Do you have the model thing into the reflexive content, and why don't you have that as a given that I'm maybe not expressing myself well because I didn't understand, because now I realize that maybe I was missing something. But in the case of Hesperus is right, if you have, why would you want to put in the reflexive content? Like, instead of whatever we refer to as Hesperus, you need to have the object itself if you are taking out the reflexive content.
Right, I think, let me see, I'll go back. Right, so we say is that, you know, the person legitimately. So it's always the object, the person, the thing. We can't really say thing. Actually, Amie Thomasson did some comments on this, and she's like, don't use thing. Don't use item. I'm like, okay, object. You know, right? So it's always about, you know, if you use it, this meets the conditions of use, you know, for this word, for this concept, right? If you have that thing still, right, and do something to it, does it still apply? Right, is what it comes down to. So it's always about the thing. Like, and we talk about like, where is it? Let's go to the vase one. That's the cleanest one. It's the easiest one to understand, right? So yeah, the object targeted by this vase, and it's the thing. That's why it's bolded, right? Meets the application conditions for a vase. There is no context of the same correct use of the vase in which that object, right, is shattered and still meets the application conditions for a vase. Right? So it's both conceptual, right? But what we're saying when we talk about like modality, and this is where people's brains get broken by modal normativism, right? Is that, okay, it's about the object, but what's important is the way we understand it under a concept, right? And so this idea of the world being at arm's length, this, you know, there's still that diagnostic thing, that Kantianism, that's at the core of a lot of pragmatism, right? And this is not an offshoot. She probably wouldn't like that, but it's comes from a pragmatist tradition. Not a neo-pragmatist tradition, because I don't think she's a Roydian, but a new pragmatist tradition, right? Closer to Peirce, right? So that kind of thing.
For follow-up, yeah, because that can be the last thing. That point you just made here can be a good point for normativism in our eyes. I mean, one problem with normativism is that somehow it forgets subject matter, or
the object, right?
It can, yeah, it forgets the matter, the word, the object, the properties. It's everything seems to be about language and giving instructions on how to use language. Now, can you give us again the Hesperus example? I mean, when we say that necessarily Hesperus, we're talking about Venus.
You're talking about Venus because that's the way it is here. No, it's the way it is here. We're talking about that. But we say, when we go to necessarily, we slip into a use of language that makes explicit how that, you know, how that meaning sub 2 of Hesperus and Phosphorus have been completed by the world, right? And then allows us to talk about that. Oh, what you're trying to say is that Hesperus just is, Venus has 2 names. There's one object that has 2 names. It's just Venus, right? That's just it.
But the fact that Venus is a necessary fact.
Well, I mean, yes, self-identity is the thing. But the thing is, here's what a pragmatist would probably say. Like, yeah, once you have the idea of a planet, right? It's like to a pragmatist, you know, you have mountains in the world, but a mountain, how's that different from a hill in a way that you can talk about absolutely physically?
Okay.
You can't.
Yeah, so that's what the disagreement comes. Right?
Yeah.
Because having the concept of a planet for them means to have the word planet and be able to use it.
This doesn't have to be a word.
And
That's the easiest way.
be able to use it correctly. Without the term, you don't have the concept of planet, do you?
Once you have it, you have a planet. That's and this is where we did always.
Once you have a
the concept of a planet, and it's a concept. You can use a word, concept. They're the same. For them, they're very similar. They back and forth between them a lot.
Concept or term.
Yeah, term.
Linguistic dependent. Concepts are linguistic dependent.
Yeah.
And for more modern, realist or restrictivist positions, that's where the difference comes. No, you can have the concept without language.
You can have the well, once you've nailed it.
Before we have.
Yeah, there are the things that we now call planets. Yeah, before language. But is there a thing called a planet out there in the world? Yeah, there's things that we now call planets that have always been around. Not always, but for several billion years.
They would concede that.
Yeah, she definitely would. Thomasson definitely would. Yeah, she definitely would. Because yeah, and the thing is, they're just saying like, yeah, okay, the world is a lot messier than our thinking about it and talking about it allows. And that leads to a form of descriptivism that goes too far, right? And which I agree with, right? Like the mountain case. Yeah, there's mountains, but well, what's the difference between a mountain and a hill? Well, that's vague. Why is it vague? Well, because we sort of made up the distinction, right? But that distinction is behaviorally and cognitively significant as if it was part of the world. It has taken on descriptive import that is really hard to pinpoint when you try and nail it down. So she just says, like, well, yeah, it's true, it's an object. And now mountains are things. And they've always been around as long as the Earth has been around. What's the difference between a mountain and an island? Water. That's all. The context. That's it. Right? On a desert planet, every island's a mountain. You know? And so that's just the way you think about it. Right? But once you have them, they've always been around. And that's what we're talking about because that's the concepts we have. And those are the objects that we deal with. And those are the things that make up the propositions that we have. Right? Those indicative sentences rapidly become descriptive feeling. And for all intents and purposes, they are. Right?
I don't know if I am going to be able to.
I am wrapping my head around if there is any way to connect this with situations and with situation theory.
I'm sure there probably is.
And I didn't, so when you use meaning one and meaning two, you are talking about that we use meaning in two different ways.
We go back
Or
and
that
forth.
there are two different meanings.
It depends on how you define meaning. Yeah. But in the literature, right, a lot of times we talk. Some people talk about meaning, they mean what is called official content, right, which is meaning sub one, right? Like some people say that the proposition, right, is the meaning.
Yeah.
John and Kepa say that something like meaning two is what creates the content, right? So it's the meaning sub two, right, leads to the content. So separate them out. And there's a type of content associated with meaning sub two, reflexive content, and other forms of use-conditional content, right? And then there's meaning sub one, which is once you have a context and you've nailed all that down, then you get that proposition, right? Another way to think about it is one is a condition on circumstances of evaluation, if you want to think about it formally, and one is a condition on contexts of use, right? Make sense?
Yeah. So, since according to situations and attitudes, the idea is what they call relational theory of meaning,
Right.
that they base it in the notion of constraint.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And you mentioned several times the idea that it is a matter of the information the individual gets,
Right.
but signals you the behavioral change. No?
Yes, the constraints. The way
that house is
Yeah.
burning or this house is burning,
Yeah. Yeah.
depending on the information I get.
Yeah.
But I don't know how to say. It's like for a word or an expression, it is, as far as I understand, it's not that many constraints can be linked to an expression.
Mm-hmm.
And since constraints are what constrain the information you get,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
with the same expression, you might be using exploiting a different constraint.
Exactly. Exactly.
In the case when you add modals, or what, maybe the flow of information comes from a different way, but
Yeah.
it's the same
Right.
as in the official content or not content.
If I understand.
Lost in that debate.
If I understand what you're talking about, is that you're basically saying that there's multiple constraints. It's not unidimensional. The constraints that exist around the world, around a concept or a word, right? And I agree 100%, right? There is stuff that's more on the semantic, theoretically side, I think you're talking about the truth and reference part of stuff. But what I tend to say is there's the conventional, the more in the language conventions as opposed to cultural conventions that change more rapidly than the fundamental linguistic conventions. They're all conventions, right? Okay. Some change faster than others. Like I use it differently, you know, things like that, right? But then there's the conventions that are baked in. When we learn the word, that's what we tend to think is the original basic language conventions, which again change, but at a slower pace than everything else, right? These are all sort of like shells of constraint, right? They can play into the meaning that you get out of it, right? What I'm trying to focus on is the sort of like the more general, sort of like at the center of it, the basic semantic meaning, quote unquote, right? Whether or not that's truth conditional or more like alas, right? Expressive, right? I think that's what you're talking about. Is that right?
Okay. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Right. Cool. Any other questions, y'all?
Some beer. There's some beers.
Let's get some. Oh yeah, let's get some beers.
Thank you very much.
No problem. Thank you.